Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at Morphy's with an Argentine brass-jacketed Maxim gun. This thing is seriously cool. This is one of the fantastic examples of a very early Maxim gun that's actually, relatively speaking, available in the United States to collectors. So let's do a little bit of background on Maxim first. Of course, Hiram Maxim invents the modern machine gun. He's the first guy to make a feasible, functional, and commercially successful self-loading, self-firing automatic gun. And it's essentially this. Now, he spends the mid-1880s getting his design right. His first, what he calls his first perfected guns, he sends two of them to Enfield in England for testing by the British military in 1887. And this is just on the cusp of the invention of smokeless powder. Maxim's early guns were in fact black powder guns. They were all chambered for, the early 11mm rifle cartridges. He can essentially build these things in any cartridge that you want. His early ones for the British were in 577, 450 Martini Henry. Believe it or not, massive things. And black powder was a real concern for Maxim. He did manage to get the guns to work reliably with black powder cartridges, which was quite a feat. That's the thing that had really defeated all prior self-loading firearms designs, was dealing with all the powder fouling. And he did that largely by having a recoil-based action, so he wasn't trying to trap gases anywhere, and thus didn't have to deal with the powder fouling from black powder as much as other mechanisms might have to. He did have a big issue with black powder smoke obscuring the battlefield and making it difficult to see where you're going to fire with this thing. These are 500 to 600 round per minute guns. You can imagine how much black powder smoke that puts out. Anyway, right about the time Maxim starts successfully testing this gun, smokeless powder is starting to reach all of the major military countries in Europe and by extension in the world. And Maxim is able to quickly tweak his gun for modern smokeless powder small bore cartridges. So now we're talking the 7 to 8mm cartridges that countries are starting to adopt and use. And that's essentially the stage of development that we have here. This is an 1889 pattern lock in this pattern of gun. It's interesting, Maxim had to do a number of things to adapt his design from black powder to smokeless. He actually had to make the water jackets bigger because despite being a smaller bore diameter, smokeless powder actually has substantially more energy contained in it, and it generates more heat, and he actually needed more water to keep the guns cool effectively than he'd had with previous black powder designs. He also had to redesign some of the recoiling mechanism so that it would better handle the different burn rates and basically pressure impulse of smokeless powder compared to the earlier black powder. So you put all of those changes together and you get essentially this gun. It's basically where the Maxim gun really hits its stride in worldwide military trials. It's not the black powder gun competing against modern smokeless cartridges. It's now a smokeless cartridge Maxim, 1889 pattern lock, the early, you'll see it in a moment when we flip the gun around, the early crank handle and recoil mechanism design. All of these magnificent cast brass parts, which are just so cool to see. This is the epitome of a steampunk machine gun because it actually comes from the era of steam power, largely. So cool. Anyway. Argentina is an early adopter of the Maxim gun. A lot of countries in South America actually bought the Hotchkiss. There were only a couple that bought Maxims. Argentina was one of them. They would ultimately buy 200 guns. The first batch from Maxim Nordenfeldt Gun and Ammunition Company Limited, and the second and third batches from DWM, Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionfabrik. And what's really cool about these is they give us they give us an example of this very first early pattern of Maxim gun. Now, Maxims were constantly evolving in their small details, and generally speaking, every country's guns are just a little bit different because he's always tweaking and improving the design. So it's not like there's a standard 1889 pattern. There isn't. But this is a perfect exemplar of the very first generation of Maxim guns that were actually commercially successful. So a little bit of history on the Argentine guns in particular. Of course, when they purchased them, they were using the Model 1891 cartridge. It was a round-nosed bullet, a big heavy bullet, round nose, and in 1909, Argentina adopted a Spitzer bullet. So lighter bullet, shorter, pointed, higher velocity. So they sent all of their guns back to DWM, even the ones they bought from Maxim Nordenfeldt, to have them reworked. They had them rechambered for the new cartridge. They had the sights rebuilt for the new cartridge, and they had a couple other things done. First off, any problems with the gun were repaired. You'll sometimes find original Maxim Nordenfeldt Argentine guns that have DWM replacement parts in them. That's from this overhaul. They added scope mount brackets to them for a 2-power, I think it was a Zeiss optic. At any rate, DWM overhauled the guns and then sent them back all new. We'll take a look at some of the markings in just a moment. They would stay in Argentine military service until 1929. They were then handed over to the police and replaced with more modern military arms. The police kept them until the late 1950s and then got rid of them. And what's really cool is in 1960, Sam Cummings, our favorite international arms dealer responsible for getting all sorts of cool stuff onto the American collector market, he managed to buy 91 of these guns from Argentina. Brought them into the US. Of those, 8 were re-exported. 28, I believe, of them went to various government agencies, organizations, museums, displays, that sort of thing, and the remaining 55 went on to the collector's market. So there are actually a remarkable number of these Argentine brass jacket Maxims in the US on the collector market, which is awesome because they're such a cool historical example of the very dawn of successful functioning machine guns. So let's take a closer look at some of the details of this thing. This is gun number 64 of Argentina's 120. So this is one of the first ones purchased in the 1898 contract. This is not a model designation, this is a contract year. Still marked Maxim's patent, and then the manufacturer is marked around the outside. Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabriken, Berlin. The Maxim Nordenfeldt ones have Maxim Nordenfeldt Gun and Ammunition Company Limited around the outside. The cartridge plate here on the top of the gun, Cartucho Mauser Argentino. Originally this said 1891 to identify the cartridge. That has been milled out and restamped 1909 because it was rebuilt, and all of the ones in the country are marked like this. There are no unmodified ones because Argentina sent literally all of its guns to DWM to be rebuilt. Now this thing's kind of cool. That's originally the spot where the rear sight sat. So that was the top end of the rear sight. Now if we zoom out here, this is the new rear sight, and it's graduated up to 2,000 meters. The original sights were 2,000 meters, and they came all the way out to here, and that should give you some idea of the difference in trajectory that you get between a heavy round-nosed low-velocity bullet and a shorter, lighter Spitzer high-velocity bullet. So again, you can see the little DWM mark. The sights were rebuilt by DWM to fit the new cartridge. All right, let's take a quick look inside the Maxim gun. If you're not familiar with how these work, well, it's actually a toggle action. Think a Luger, but huge, water-cooled, and made half out of brass. The toggle joint itself is right here. So when this crank handle is connected to this element of the toggle link. So what happens when you fire, this, by the way, this is the bolt. This is your feed tray. The chamber is right up here. When you fire, the whole internal mechanism cycles backward under recoil, like so. As it does, this part of the crank handle is going to impact this block, which is solidly mounted on the outside of the receiver. And notice the difference in curvature down here. So I'm going to go push on the barrel, simulating recoil of the gun. You can see what happens there. The two curvatures on these two parts interact to push this crank handle up, which breaks the toggle joint inside. And it does this with enough energy that the bolt cycles all the way back like this. You can see the extractor drop right here. It's then going to go forward. The next cartridge will be accessible right here from the belt. As it goes forward, it's going to grab the next cartridge. The extractor rises up. The lock recocks itself, and it's ready to fire. The firing trigger is located back here. It's this guy under my thumbs, It does have a safety on it. Notice it says Seguridad on the top. That's in the safe position. When I flip this up, it now says Fuego, or fire. And now when I push the trigger forward, you can hear it click, and it has just fired. If I cycle the action, I can dry fire it again. When I do press the trigger, what I'm doing is pulling that bar in the bottom of the receiver backwards. Now we're at the front end of the receiver. I'm holding the bolt open so you can see that trigger bar again, and right there is a little lip that's going to pull the sear back. It's pretty easy to take the lock out of a Maxim gun. All you have to do is open the crank handle up, pull it all the way back, and then we can just lift this up, and then there's an interrupted thread right here on the back, and I can pull this whole mechanism out of the gun. So this is the extractor. That's obviously where it's going to fire. It's going to pull a cartridge off of the belt here, push it down to here where it fires, and then push it down once again after it's fired, when it's empty, down here where it gets ejected out the bottom of the gun. Now, when the lock is cocked, this is the trigger. So when I pull this back, you're going to see this snap up. If I can hold this all in place without snapping my finger in it. There we go. That has fired, and you can see how this tab sticks down in the bottom of the receiver to be actuated by the thumb trigger. So that's the basic action going on inside a Maxim gun. Now, distinctive elements of these early pattern guns, obviously the first bit is all of the brass. Brass early on was something that was easier to cast than steel, and that's why it was used. By the way, we have oilers in the grip handles, which is kind of cool. Anyway, it wouldn't be that long before steel replaced brass for all the castings, just for the sake of strength and material cost and construction efficiency. The design of this system right here would be simplified quite a bit as well. So notice we even have this extra tab up here, which is just, it's a buffer for the crank handle here to ensure that it doesn't over travel and break anything. This system gets simplified quite a lot in future versions of the gun. We also have this guy. Like, how cool is that? There's actually like a walnut wooden roller as part of the feed system. So the whole feed tray would get much simplified over time, but what we have right now is a brass casting. It's got a steel reinforcement here. In fact, this was something that was added by DWM during the retrofit because the cartridge overall length gets shorter with the Spitzer 1909 cartridge, but they kept this wooden roller that's in there just to essentially reduce friction of the belt coming into the gun. It's just, that's in fact the only piece of wood on this entire gun is that feedway roller. You want to talk about old school, there is actually a leather seat on the tripod where the gunner sits. And this looks kind of rough, but this is actually in amazingly good shape. That's the original leather from when this thing was made in 1898. So that's fantastically well preserved. People often ask how the steam recirculates back into water on a Maxim gun, and the answer is it doesn't. So this jacket is full of water, and the barrel's located in the bottom. You can see it's down at the bottom there. So as long as there's water in the jacket, and by the way, this is the fill plug. So you open it up. There was originally a brilliantly expensive little brass funnel that came with these so that you could fill the water jacket up. And then as long as there's water in the jacket, no matter how much you shoot, the water will not get to be more than 212 Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius, because once the water is at its boiling point, any additional energy that comes into it, instead of raising the temperature, it changes some of the water into steam. There is a steam vent on the other side, and that's it right there. So you would attach a steam hose here, and the newly vaporized steam comes out this port, down your hose, and into a can, a condensing can. You put a little bit of water in the bottom of the can, and you put this hose under the level of the water, and then when steam comes in, the liquid water cools it enough to recondense it back into more liquid water. Now you can leave a hose off of here. If you don't have one on and you get the water in the jacket boiling, you will just get a cloud of steam coming out this vent and going up and telling everybody where you are, which if you're training, no big deal. If you're actually in combat, could be a pretty big deal. Anyway, eventually, if you shoot enough, you will in fact boil all the water out of the jacket, and once the barrel is no longer in contact with water, additional energy dumped into the barrel will just raise its temperature. So once you're out of water, you can see this barrel is actually pretty thin, and this gun will overheat pretty quickly once there's no water in it. So what's the solution? Well, you go back to your fill port. Yep, that fill plug right there. You unscrew that and pour all the water back into it. That's your recirculating system. Essentially, it's one of the crew members manually recirculating the water. There were experiments done on mechanical recirculating systems, especially with vehicular mounted guns, but they were just never really worthwhile. They were too complex, too likely to break down, and you know, it's not that big a deal to just refill the thing manually. One other element that's kind of unique to the Maxim gun, we see this because it's an early developmental thing that eventually would be simplified and basically automated for the user, is the fusee spring cover. So if I push this forward and lift it off, that is the main spring of the gun, and it's sitting here on the outside, and I can actually adjust how tight it is. This gauge right here tells me how much tension I've put on the fusee spring. It's called a fusee spring instead of a mainspring just because of anachronicity, basically. Interestingly, the Argentines actually put a little data plate on each gun designating what the tension needed to be. So this one needs to be between 25 and 40 millimeters of tension, gun number 64. Well, this one is currently sitting at like 13 millimeters, which means there's not nearly enough spring tension, and it means the gun probably won't go back into battery successfully if I try to start shooting it. It's going to short stroke. So what I do is use this little crank at the front of the fusee spring cover to tighten the system up. And essentially I'm just pre-stretching the spring a bit more. So we'll do this a little bit. There we go. Now we're at 20. I would want to keep going a little higher. I'd want to be in that range designated for the gun. This will also affect the rate of fire. So once we have it in a range where it will effectively, reliably operate, the higher the tension is, the faster the bolt will come back into battery, and the higher the rate of fire. And some people think that this is just a rate of fire adjustment, because that's the practical impact. If you don't know what's going on, what you see is the tighter I crank it up, the faster the gun runs. Well, the problem is, if you run it too high, the gun will actually start battering itself. If you have too much tension or too little on the mainspring, frankly, either way, you'll start damaging components either when the gun goes into battery or when it slams into the back of the receiver on the unlocking stroke. So yes, this does change the rate of fire, but that's not its purpose. That's a secondary effect of what you're really trying to do, which is set the mainspring so that the gun will run reliably and safely. And if you do this right, Maxim guns will run for tens and tens and tens of thousands of rounds without a problem. All right, I don't think there's a whole lot else we need to go over here. I will point out the adjustments on the tripod here. This is the original tripod that came with the Argentine Maxims. The screw here adjusts the gun elevation up and down. We've got a little track right here, also up here, that will allow me to move the gun left to right. This little pad is, it doesn't want to come loose. The idea of these two little pads is that you can move them on the windage track to set limits to the gun. So if you have a specific field of fire, you can set that field of fire up when you put the tripod in place, and then guys can just swing the gun left to right and not have to worry about exceeding their given zone of fire. Anyway, that's how the tripod works, and I think that's about it. It really doesn't get any more steampunk than this. Big thanks to Morphees for giving me access to this to film for you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.